Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In today's video, we are going to unbox, reveal, discuss, and upgrade this Bedecked Brokers pre-constructed EDH deck from the Streets of New Capenna. What's up, MTGBC? That is the MTG Burgeoning community. Thank you for joining me as we are moments away from liberating the contents of the Bedecked Brokers pre-constructed deck from the Streets of New Capenna. So let's get right to it and let's remove the seal because there's no going back now. All right, we spill the contents forward. There's the sweet... Oh, look at that again with those damaged deck boxes. Oh, baby. All right, so we got nothing left in there, so that's out. We have our little... we got some counters this time. All right, I suppose because the Bedecked Brokers deck has to do with counters, we're going to get a little bit more for our bang here by punching out Death Touch, Vigilance, First Strike. There's the shield counter, Double Strike, Trample, and up there we have -1/-1 flying and hexproof, and that oh so sweet divider, which actually is kind of, it's not foily, but it looks like it's got a pretty nice foil to it, which is a pretty nice touch. All right, so we have that, and I think this is 4 out of 5. 4 out of 5 of the deck boxes, which personally I don't use. But for any players who might use these, they're not coming out in the greatest condition. Not at all. So that might be something that, you know, just a little bit of glue, pushing it back into place. I don't know if that would be enough. But that is damaged deck box 4 out of 5. We'll get rid of our extra packaging here. We have our pamphlet on how to play. We have our life wheel. We have our collector booster sample pack, which will be saved for a greater purpose. And then, of course, we have the sweet pre-constructed deck. As usually is the case with these pre-constructed EDH decks, each deck comes with 2 possible commanders. The front-facing commander of the Bedecked Brokers build is Perry the Pulverizer. We have a 3/3 Rhino Soldier for 1 in Bant colors, and when Perry ETBs, we put a shield counter on target creature, so we could put the shield counter on Perry himself. Whenever Perry attacks, target creature we control gains trample and gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of different kinds of counters among permanents we control. And again, that attack trigger can also target Perry. So for the purposes of building around Perry, more likely than not, you're going to look to build a Voltron deck. And the secondary commander of this build is Cross Defense Contractor. For the same mana value, we're getting a 2/4 Cat Advisor that at the beginning of our upkeep, we put a shield counter on target creature and opponent controls. And of course, a shield counter is a counter that gives the creature kind of like protection. If it's dealt any damage or if it were to be destroyed and it has a shield counter on it, then we remove the shield counter instead. So it's not as potent of a defense as Totem Armor is, but it's still a new counter introduced through this set and through this build. So with these shield counters that we're placing onto our opponents, we're kind of giving our opponents some additional creature protection, which, I don't know, if you know the channel and you know MTG Burgeoning, we are not really in the business of helping out our opponents. So let's read Krause's other block of text. Whenever we put 1 or more counters on a creature we don't control, we tap that creature and we goad it. it gains trample until our next turn. And of course, to go to creature, it means that it must attack during its next combat if able, and it must attack an opponent other than us. And although it's a very interesting and unique build to do that, to protect the creature and then have it go off into combat against one of our other opponents, gold is really a mechanic that's more heavily supported in red. And here we're dealing with Bant colors. So I'm not so sure that taking the avenue with Kraus is the best way to build an upgrade around the Bedecked Brokers pre-constructed deck. So for the purposes of the rest of this video, we are going to proceed as if Perry the Pulverizer was our general. Like the previous decks before it, Bedecked Brokers also has some cards that are very unique to the deck itself. There is also a small sampling of cards straight from the Streets of New Capenna set. We're going to begin with those cards and then move right to the cards that are unique to the Bedecked Brokers build. And we're going to start, of course, with Broker's Charm. This is our new Bant charm, so we're going to cast it and choose one of the following 3 modes. Target creature we control will get +1/+0 till end of turn, and it deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. So this is a nice form of removal. It's almost fight-esque, although we don't have to worry about a crackback from our opponent. If we don't want that mode, then we can destroy target enchantment, or we can draw 2 cards. So we have some potential creature or planeswalker removal, enchantment removal, and the ability to draw 2 cards. Broker's Charm may be the most valuable of the new charms. Next card up is Exotic Pets, our second instant. This one costs 1 in Azorius colors, and we will create 2 1/1 blue fish creature tokens with this creature can't be blocked. Then for each kind of counter among creatures we control, put a counter of that kind on either of those tokens. So that's a pretty good investment at instant speed to get 2 unblockable creatures that are each going to get another counter on them, as long as we have counters on other creatures we control at the time of casting Exotic Pets. And lastly, we have Broker's Hideout. This is the, I suppose we've been saying, the evolution or potentially the de-evolution of Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. This comes down into play and is tapped and sacrificed. I'm not even tapped. This comes into play and is sacrificed immediately. And when we do, you're going to search your library for a basic forest, plains, or island card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then we gain 1 life. Now, Terramorphic Expanse nor Evolving Wilds allows us to gain the 1 life. However, they let us search our library for any basic land and does not limit it to one of the 3 colors that Broker's Hideout does. So in a traditional or in a strict Bant build, Broker's Hideout is decent enough to remain in the 99. Anything that we decide to add more colors to, and this may not be as valuable as adding just the simple classics of Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse. All right, and now we're going to get to the cards that are brand new and unique to this Bedecked Brokers build. And we're going to begin with Angelic Sleuth, the 2/3 angel for 2 and a white. And of course, she flies. I'm hoping it's a she. I can't really tell. It looks like it's a she. Going to go with she. Going to go with she here. All right, the text for Angelic Sleuth reads, whenever another permanent we control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, we get to investigate. And in a deck that's focused on counters, and we're going to see later in the video the upgrades as well, having the ability to, gain a benefit by getting a clue token whenever one of these permanents leaves the battlefield, which of course we can just pay 2, sacrifice it, and draw a card, we're getting more value based upon the archetype and theme of our deck. All right, next up, we have Contractual Safeguard. It's an instant for 2 and a white with the addendum mechanic, which means if we cast this during our main phase, we get to put a shield counter on a creature we control. And of course, the shield counter that we talked about earlier, if a creature was dealt damage or destroyed, we remove the shield counter instead. And the bottom text reads, choose a kind of counter on a creature we control and put a counter of that kind on each other creature we control. Extremely powerful for just 2 white and for 2 and a white at instant speed, particularly in a deck that's focused on different types of counters. If we have a trample counter on one creature, well, now we have a trample counter on every creature. If we have a +1/+1 counter on a creature, now we're going to put a +1/+1 counter on all of those creatures, minimally without any other counters on the battlefield on any of our creatures. We can give each one of them a shield counter just by casting Contractual Safeguard. That is a card that would be very strong in this continued build, and also a card that would be extremely strong in a Zaxara build. I'm sorry, not Zaxara. I misspoke. Not Zaxara. In a Cathril build. I got my 3-color creatures mixed up. That would be a great card to add in a Cathril build. All right, next up we have a board wipe. It's Damning Verdict, 3 and 2 white. Destroy all creatures with no counters on them. Continuing to emphasize the importance of having counters by including a board wipe that destroys any creatures that don't. All right, next card up is Resourceful Defense, an enchantment for 2 and a white. Whenever a permanent we control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, we put those counters on target permanent we control. Then we can pay 4 and a white, and we can move any number of counters from one target permanent we control to another target permanent that we control. This kind of is a variation to the Ozolith, which actually is not included in this deck, but as you'll see later on in this video, will most likely be discussed. This gives us another way in which to make sure that any counters on creatures or any permanents, because let's face it, Resourceful Defense is not just creature specific, so we can also use that for planeswalkers or other enchantments or artifacts or lands. Either way, Resourceful Defense helps to add some more redundancy to the ability to keep recycling these counters amongst our permanents. Next up, staying with mono white, we have Skyboon Evangelist. It's a 3/3 bird advisor with flying for 4 and white. When it ETBs, we get to support 6. Wow, support 6. We're going to put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 6 other target creatures just when this ETBs. That is a massive, massive benefit for a deck that, let's face it, is all about counters. Whenever a creature with a counter on it attacks one of our opponents, that creature gains flying until end of turn. So not only is this bird advisor going to come down and spread the love in the form of massive +1/+1 counters, but whenever any one of our creatures attacks and it has a counter on it, it's going to get the gift of flying. And that evasive combat in combination with the power toughness boosts, that makes Skyboon Evangelists one of the most valuable cards in the 99 of this build if we are planning to build around the theme counter. All right, now we're going to shift from mono white to mono blue, and we have Aven Courier. It's a 1 and a blue for a 1/1, another bird advisor. This one, of course, has flying, and whenever Aven Courier attacks, we choose a counter on a permanent we control, and we put a counter of that kind on target permanent we control if it doesn't have a counter of that kind on it. Again, we're accentuating the counter theme by just making sure that they are as plentiful as possible on everything and anything that's on our battlefield. Next, we have Shield Broker, a 3/4 Cephalid Advisor for 3 and 2 blue. When the CTBs, we put a shield counter on target non-commander creature we control. I'm sorry, I've said that again. Non-commander creature we don't control, and then we gain control of that creature for as long as it has a shield counter on it. So this is really just some control magic on the body of a 3/4 with a mana value of 5. And we cannot target a commander, but that's okay because there's many, many other valuable creatures out there on the battlefield that aren't coming from the command zone. Next, we have Storm of Forms. It's an instant for 3 and a blue. When we cast the spell, we can copy it for each kind of counter among permanents we control, and we may choose new targets for the copies. And then we can return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. This is ridiculous. This could almost be a Cyclonic Rift based upon how many different types of counters we have going on in the 99 of this build. 7 different counters. We're putting 7 different target non-land permanents to their owner's hands, and we're only paying 3 and a blue mana to do that. Storm of Forms is going to act as, let's face it, it's going to be Cyclonic Rift's little buddy. All right, moving from mono blue, we're going to head on over to mono green now, and this time it is Bribe Taker, a 6/6 Rhino Warrior with Trample for 5 and 1 green mana. When Bribe Taker ETBs, for each kind of counter on permanents we control, we may put our choice of a +1/+1 counter or a counter of that kind on Bribe Taker. So this guy's going to come down, and depending on the shape of our battlefield with respect to the counters that are on our creatures, or our permanents, because remember, this is not just creature specific for Bribe Taker. We could really end up having a massive threat that we can send into combat just because of what we could end up putting on Bribe Taker when it ETBs. This is almost screaming like a pseudo Cathril Aspect Warper. Next up, mono green, we have Family's Favor enchantment for 2 and a green. Whenever we attack, we put a shield counter on target attacking creature. Until end of turn, it gains. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we remove a shield counter from it, and if we do, we draw a card. So it's nice that, well, let's face it, this doesn't, to me, on the face of it, seem like an extraordinarily strong card. I will say, if it said something about whenever a creature we control attacks, that would make this card ridiculously bonkers. But to me, on the face of it, it just seems a little bit slow. We're going to put the shield counter onto the creature, which will allow it to enter into combat most likely, without getting destroyed, because if it does get blocked, then we remove the shield counter and we get to keep the creature on the battlefield and it doesn't get destroyed. If it doesn't get blocked and it hits for combat damage, well, then we get to remove that shield counter to draw a card instead. Just seems like a lot of different hoops that has to be dropped for an investment. I mean, investment is only 2 and a green. Maybe it's just one of those cards that would benefit from some play testing. Next up, we have Park Heights Maverick, a 2/2 human soldier for 2 and a green mana with the Dethrone mechanic. Many moons have passed since we last saw Dethrone. Whenever this creature attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, we put a +1/+1 counter on it. Park Heights Maverick cannot be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, whenever Park Heights Maverick deals combat damage to a player or dies, I got a little tripped up there with the wording to a player or dies. Okay, so whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player or whenever this creature dies, we get to proliferate. And proliferate, let's face it, we have not seen a great number of proliferate cards so far in this build. Granted, we're only a few cards into the brand new cards that have been just specific to the Streets of New Capenna and the Bedecked Brokers Commander deck. Hopefully when we get to the reprints, we'll see a lot more of the proliferate mechanic, particularly as that could be a very powerful synergy with the new shield counters introduced in this set. All right, moving to multicolored, we have Agent's Toolkit. It's a clue for 1 and Simic colors. We have a clue that, let's face it, is still a clue at the very bottom. It says we can pay 2 and sacrifice this to draw a card. So let's see what else this Simic clue can do for us. When it ETBs, it does so with a +1/+1 counter, a flying counter, a death touch counter, and a shield counter on it. Whenever a creature enters a battlefield under our control, we may move a counter from Agent's Toolkit onto that creature. And then once the toolkit has been emptied, or it's suffering some form of spot or mass removal, we can always pay 2, sacrifice it, and get a card back. Pretty good in the long game, I have to say, if we're able to get this down in the early game and have enough turns for when our creatures come into play to get those counters off of Agent's Toolkit and onto our creatures. Then we can just pay the 2, sack, draw a card. That seems like I could have some sneaky synergies with what we want to do in this deck. Next up, we're going to stay with our multicolored, and we're going to talk about Broker's Confluence. Here we have an instant for 2 and Bant colors. We get to choose 3 of the following modes, and we get to pick each mode more than once if we so choose. And there it is, the very first mode. I figured it was really only a matter of time. We can choose to proliferate, and when we proliferate, we choose any number of permanents and or players, and give each another counter of each kind that's already there. Mode number 2 is target creature phases out. That's a nice one too. And mode number 3, counter target activated or triggered ability. Broker's Confluence seems like it's bringing a lot of power to this Bant deck. And even if we only ever choose to proliferate 3 times, imagine having some creatures on the battlefield with shield counters on them, and now they have triple the amount, I'm sorry, not triple, now they have 3 times more the amount they had before we cast Broker's Confluence. All right, 2 cards left, 1 more multicolor card, and that's going to be Denry Klin, Editor-in-Chief, 2/2 Cat Advisor for 2 and Azorius colors. Denry Klin ETBs with our choice of a +1/+1 counter, First Strike, or Vigilance counter. Whenever a non-token creature we control ETBs, if Denry has any counters on it, put the same number and kind of counters on that creature. So if we can get Denry into play with our choice of one of those counters, and then find some additional ways to put more counters on it, particularly with the shield counters, then every time that we get a creature into play, as long as it's a non-token creature, any counters on Denry are also going to be put onto that creature. Denry could be a very, very menacing threat on the battlefield if left unchecked. And the last unique card to this Bedecked Brokers EDH deck, it is Gavel of the Righteous. Here we have an equipment it's kind of a mana cost of 2 and an equip cost of pay 3 or remove a counter from Gavel of the Righteous. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we put a charge counter on this equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each counter on Gavel of the Righteous. As long as Gavel of the Righteous has 4 or more counters on it, equipped creature has double strike. So we gotta wait 4 turns if this is going to trigger on its own, just to give the creature +4/+4 and double strike. I'll leave that up to how the MTGBC decides to evaluate that card. Now let's take a brief look at the reprints included in this Bedecked Brokers deck and how they synergize with the counter theme presented in the 99. We're going to begin with Avenging Hunt Bonder. Whenever this attacks, we'll put a double strike counter on another attacking creature. Declaration in Stone is going to act as some removal. Hoofprints of the Stag is going to give us a hoofprint counter, which is important for Perry the Pulverizer because the more variation of counters we have, the larger his +X/+X ability will be. Luminarch Aspirant will throw around a +1/+1 counter at the beginning of combat on our turn. Here is Planar Outburst. That's nice to see, to destroy all non-land creatures, which pretty much means destroy all creatures that aren't creature lands. And for the Awaken cost of 5 and triple white, we can also create a creature land. Together Forever will throw around some +1/+1 counters. Midnight Clock will give us another type of counter, which is an hour counter. Tezzeret's Gambit, we're going to have to draw some cards and proliferate. Forgotten Ancient, +1/+1 counters for days. Incubation Druid, more with the +1/+1 counter theme. Rishkar Pima Renegade is going to reward us for those +1/+1 counters on our creatures by allowing us to tap them for a green mana. Oh, I'm sorry, not even for +1/+1 counters. Any creature with a counter on it can tap for 1 green mana. Rishkar's Expertise, that's going to have us draw some cards and play a free spell. Scavenging Ooze is going to mess with some graveyards, get some more +1/+1 counters on it. Slippery Bogbender will come down with Flash and then put a hexproof counter on it when it ETBs. Steelbane Hydra, +1/+1 counters and target artifact and enchantment removal. Johnny Unyielding, also going to give us some +1/+1 counters if we can reach its Big Bang ability of -9. And if we do, we'll put 5 +1/+1 counters on each creature we control and 5 loyalty counters on each other planeswalker we control. Surprisingly, Ajani is the only planeswalker included in this build, and its +2 or -2 abilities do not synergize with the theme of this deck. This could be one of the cards on the chopping block as a way in which to fortify our various counter theme. Aben Mimeomancer is going to come down and mess with base power and toughness with a feather counter, of course. Fathom Mage will give us some +1/+1 counters on her and let us draw some cards. Janara, Asura of War. So good to see her finally getting a reprint. She flies and she can get bigger and bigger with +1/+1 counters. Rololask Apex Hybrid is here, the 4/5 Trampler. It's going to throw 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature we control when it ETBs, but when it dies, we proliferate 2 times. All right, Vorel will allow us to double the number of each kind of counter on an artifact, creature, or land. The Crystalline Giant. If Crystalline Giant can get onto the battlefield very early in the game and is left untouched, every time it gets to the beginning of our combat, we're going to put a different type of counter on Crystalline Giant. And as you can see, there are so many counters from which to choose that if left uncontested, it will end up with 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 different counters on a creature that only cost us 3 mana. All right, Oblivion Stone, we're going to have a Fate counter, and that's going to act as a mass removal to get rid of every non-land permanent that doesn't have a face counter on it will be destroyed. All right, we have Oracle's Vault, another counter, Brick counter. All right, some removal and Generous Gift, Grateful Apparition. This is going to allow us to proliferate whenever this deals combat damage to a player or a planeswalker. Skyship Plunderer, again, we're going to come down, it's going to be a 2/1. And then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, for each kind of counter on target permanent or player, give that permanent or player another kind of that counter. +1/+1, Shield, those seem to be the best options. Thrumming Bird is going to proliferate each time it deals combat damage to a player. Here we'll get to put some +1/+1 counters on each creature we control with flying, and it sure seems like there are a lot of them in this build. And even if there isn't, when this creature ETBs, we put a flying counter on a non-human creature we control. Devoted Druid will have -1/-1 counters, a new kind of counter that we haven't talked about yet in this build. Evolution Sage, every time a land enters the battlefield under our control, we will proliferate. It's important that it says whenever a land enters the battlefield as opposed to when we play a land, because if we only have one land play per turn, we're only going to proliferate once. However, we're playing green, and green has a lot of ways to put lands onto the battlefield, not just from playing it from our hand. All right, Wall of Roots, there's a -0/-1 counter, another type of counter. Wickerbaugh Elder is going to have another -1/-1 counter synergy, and as a bonus, we can pay a green and remove a -1/-1 counter to destroy an artifact or enchantment. There's the Bant Charm, destroy target artifact, put target creature on the bottom of its owner library, or counter target instant spell. Primal Empathy. Now, this is what we're talking about here. We have our enchantment for 1 in Simic. At the beginning of our upkeep, we'll draw a card if we control a creature with the greatest power among creatures on the battlefield. And if we don't, then we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. Either we're drawing a card or we're putting a counter on one of our creatures. Either way, that's both. That's 2 things that we want to do. Urban Evolution, draw some cards, play an extra land. There's our Arcane Signet reprint, Commander Sphere reprint. Everflowing Chalice will give us those charge counters. Felwire Stone, another fantastic reprint. Power Conduit, another charge counter artifact. And there's our Soul Ring, and there is our Swiftfoot Boots. So from just reviewing the reprints of this deck, it seems as if they went very high on the +1/+1 counter synergy, which leaves a lot of room for maneuverability when talking about optimizing Perry's +X ability by lessening the number of +1/+1 cards and adding cards that give counters of many different kinds. And this is a portion of the land base that has been included in this Bedecked Brokers pre-constructed deck. We're going to begin with 4 basic plains, 3 basic islands, and 4 basic forests. And as a nice bonus for the first time ever for these cycles of pre-constructed commander decks, it is also including a full art, alternate art land, basic land for each one of the colors. So we have our plains, which will bring our plain total count up to 5. Island, which will bring our islands up to 4, and then our forest, which will bring that total up to 5. So that's 14 basic lands in the mana base of this deck. And as a color fixing guide, we are also going to have 2 filter lands. We jam a colorless mana into these filter lands, tap it for either a green, white, or a white, blue. We have the show lands, which is a fortified village and a port town. These lands will come into play untapped as long as we show a basic land that they're looking for. Now, for fortified village, we're going to have to show a forest or a plains in order for it to come into play untapped. And for port town, we're going to need to show an island or a plains for that land to come into play tapped. And lastly, we have a battle land. We have the Canopy Vista for the Selesnian colors and the Prairie Stream for the Azorius colors. And each of these 2 lands will come into play untapped as long as we control 2 or more basic lands. And from a dual color land perspective, the only other land of which to note, and it is a big land to note and something that is extraordinarily refreshing to see starting to creep in to these pre-constructed commander decks, and that is an enemy filter land. We have a Flooded Grove here. There is an enemy filter land in each one of the Streets of New Capenna pre-constructed commander decks, and it is fantastic to see that. We're going to jam a green or a blue mana into this, turn it sideways, and our end result will be either 2 green mana, 2 blue mana, or 1 of each. Additionally, if unneeded, we can just tap this for 1 colorless mana. So that is really our color fixing as it pertains to the dual color lands. And the following, this is where we start to have a little bit of a concerned conversation about the mana base predominantly affecting this deck. The following 8 lands, these lands all enter the battlefield tapped. So just so far, we have 14 basics and 7, we'll call them dual lands at this point in time. That's a total of 21. We have 8 that are about to come down, and that's going to be more than 25% of the lands that we've shown so far are going to enter the battlefield tapped. Now, some of these lands do lend to the archetype of counters, but I think if we were to revise the non-land cards in the 99 to differentiate the different types of counters that we can put into this build, then we can get rid of some of these other lands that come into play tapped as a way in which to continue to establish tempo when we're sitting at the EDH table. It's going to be a maddening feature to play land after land that comes into play tapped when all of our opponents are not doing that. So for the purposes of for complete clarity, these are the lands that are included. These are the lands that are included that I would probably find a way in which to replace immediately. And we're going to start with the entire possible Vivid cycle. These are lands that are going to come into play tapped, but they do come into play tapped with 2 charge counters on them. They tap for 1 mana of their appropriate color, or we can tap them to remove a charge counter from one of them for 1 mana of any color. Again, they're coming into play tapped, so you're slowing your tempo. It does provide mana fixing, although it is only at best for 2 activations. Once those charge counters are gone, if we don't put any more charge counters on these lands, then we're just playing with tap lands. And let's face it, folks, we need to not play with tap lands. So 3 vivid lands, all of which I would absolutely try to replace in the mana base of this deck. Another land included specifically as a way in which to augment the power of the counter-specific theme woven into this build is Llanowar Reborn. It comes into play tapped. It taps for a green mana. It has Graft 1, which means when this ETBs, it does so with a +1/+1 counter on it. And whenever a creature ETBs, we may move a +1/+1 counter from this land onto that creature. As we talked about earlier, with the high number of +1/+1 counter cards and effects already in the 99 of this build, replacing Llanowar Reborn with a land that would be a better fit to establish better tempo should not be difficult to do. Next, we have Litjara Mirror Lake. This comes into play tapped. It taps for a blue. We can pay 2 green, a blue, tap this, and sacrifice it. So we're going to invest 5 mana and sacrifice a land in order to create a token that's a copy of target creature we control, except it enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And we can only activate this as a sorcery. So we're investing 5 mana, losing a land, only at sorcery speed to get a copy of a creature that's only going to have a +1/+1 counter on it. A lot of what we said about Llanowar Reborn, we can also say about Litjara Mirror Lake. With a +1/+1 counter theme already so strong in the deck, weakening it by replacing this land with a better one should not hurt the overall deck's power. All right, next up, this technically is considered one of the dual color lands, but I wanted to have it saved for this enter the battlefield part that we're talking about. It is Temple of Mystery. ETB's tapped, and when it does, we get to scry 1, and it gives us a green or a blue. These are one of the scry lands, and let's face it, in a 3-color build, we can easily replace this with a check land or one of the inappropriately named slow lands that are perfect for Commander. Replacing Temple of Mystery would not be hard to do with either one of those types of lands. Next up, Seaside Citadel. It does come into play tapped, but it does give us 1 mana of any of the colors we need to cast the spells in our deck. However, this would be easily replaced by the appropriate new Triome, which I'm going to start calling the Boss Lands. The new boss land from Streets of New Capenna, which acts as a Triome from Ikoria. It has the 3 land types, and if needed, we can also pay 3 to cycle it away. Seaside Citadel could be easily replaced by that land and instantly receive an upgrade. The next land, which is a little bit tricky to talk about because this is not a dedicated tribal build. This is not a Rhino Soldier tribal build. We don't have tons of rhinos. We don't have tons of soldiers. So I wonder how often we're going to be able to get the benefit of the scry ability from Path of Ancestry. This comes into play tapped. It will give us 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity, but we're not going to really get the benefit of scrying 1 because how many creatures that we cast are going to share a creature type with our commander? If we're playing Perry the Pulverizer, how many rhinos or soldier creatures do we have in the deck? This comes into play tapped as well. I think if possible, replacing Path of Ancestry with a Reflecting Pool or a Mana Confluence would be a much better fit for what we want to do in this deck. All right, now let's talk about a few cards that, if fetch lands are available, may be a better way to go than playing with a copy of Bant Panorama. It will tap for a colorless mana, and it only costs us 1 to activate this to sacrifice it for a basic forest, plains, island, and then put that onto the battlefield tapped. So Bant Panorama is not one of the worst quote-unquote fetch lands that we could find, but if you have the ability to upgrade that, please do so. That is exactly my feeling for Myriad Landscape. This comes into play tapped. Another land that comes into play tapped. I didn't have it in the previous set because I wanted to keep it for the quote-unquote fetch land discussion. This comes into play tapped. We can tap for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap this and sacrifice it to search our library for up to 2 basic land cards that share a land type. And that's where this card gets me every single time. We're playing 3 colors. What if we need both colors? Why are we going to limit ourselves to getting 2 basics from the exact same color when we're playing 3 colors? Myriad Landscape is a card that's much, much better in a monocolor deck and even in a 2-color deck, but 3 and up, plus an ETB's tapped, I would find a way to replace Myriad Landscape with maybe a Fabled Passage, maybe a Prismatic Vista. Better option than what Myriad Landscape provides. And lastly, although not coming into play tapped, we have our Ash Barrens. Comes into play and can give us a colorless mana, or we can cycle it away for 1 and search our library for a basic land. That one I would advocate keeping unless you have a better option available. All right, just a few lands left, and we have a couple of utility lands that we want to talk about that are absolutely perfectly placed for the purposes of this deck. The first is Nesting Grounds. One colorless mana is what it provides, or we can pay one colorless mana, tap this, and move a counter from target permanent we control onto another target permanent. So it doesn't have to be one that we control. The only thing that is a little bit glitchy is you can only do that at any time that you can cast a sorcery, so no instant speed counter shenanigans with Nesting Grounds. Speaking of shenanigans, we have Karn's Bastion, one colorless mana as the result of turning this land sideways, or we pay 4, tap it, and we proliferate, getting those counters all over the place. Last utility land, it is Gavany Township, another colorless mana, or we pay 2 in Selesnyan colors to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. A land that absolutely blows out of the water, Llanowar Reborn. And to shore up the land base, we have our 2 staple lands, one of which has been there for the entire time, and the second seems like it's becoming more and more of a staple with every passing deck. Command Tower and Exotic Orchard. It's nice to see Exotic Orchard being reprinted in pretty much every single Commander deck these days. Folks, I can attest that that has not always been the case. And here are the rest of the contents of the Bedecked Brokers EDH deck. We have our thicker cut Perry the Pulverizer foil proxy card, looking pretty sweet there, and with that foil there's just going to be no chance of a curl. And here are our tokens. We have an elemental, another elemental, lots of elementals. Look at all those elementals. We have our fish that can't be blocked. We have that old elephant for generous gift, and there's our copy token, and on the back sides we have a clue, another clue, lots of clues, so many clues. Look at all those clues, nothing but clues. Look at all of those different clues. And then we have our +1/+1 counter punch-out card, which on the back side gives us some shield counters and some charge counters. Nice to see the charge counters finally getting some kind of print. And lastly, popular Magic formats and what to do on your turn. Bedecked Brokers is a counter-focused Bant build that looks to take advantage of various counters for the purposes of out-resourcing their opponents. With this dynamic in mind, the following cards are some possible upgrades to the original deck list, each of which enhances the established theme of this build. Since this deck cares about various counters, we should keep an eye on diversifying these counters when upgrading this build. Vivian, Monster's Advocate, puts Reach, Trample, or Vigilance counters on 3/3 green beast creature tokens. She also provides additional outlets for getting creatures onto the battlefield, which is definitely a plus in this build. Elspeth Resplendent puts a +1/+1 counter and either a flying, first strike, lifelink, or vigilance counter on a creature we control, and also provides outlets for getting creatures onto the battlefield. Our first 2 additions, both planeswalkers, combine to put 7 different counters on creatures we control. Whenever a creature we control without flying dies, Luminous Broodmoth returns it to the battlefield with a flying counter on it. Speaking of counters, look at how many different counters Crystalline Giant could put on itself. Azor's Elocutors gets filibuster counters. At the beginning of our upkeep, we put a filibuster counter on Azor's Elocutors, and if we have at least 5 filibuster counters on it, we win the game. This is an alternate win condition that fits the flavor and theme of this deck wonderfully. If putting various counters on our permanents is the theme of this deck, then Kodama of the West Tree is one of the payoffs for doing so. Each creature that has a counter on it is modified, and whenever a modified creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. That could lead to a lot of ramp. Ominous Seas deals with 4 shadow counters. We can remove 8 of these counters and create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token. If needed, we could also cycle it away.
Whenever a non-token creature we control dies, we put a slime counter on Gutter Grime. Then we create a green ooze creature token whose power and toughness are each equal to the number of slime counters on Gutter Grime. This enchantment provides another type of counter and creates bigger and bigger ooze creature tokens each time one of our non-token creatures dies. Whenever a creature leaves the battlefield, if it had any counters on it, we put those counters on the Ozolith instead. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. The deck doesn't care where the counters are, only that they are different. The Bedecked Brokers Bant Precon deck features a Counters Matter archetype, where its pilot is rewarded from filling the 99 with various counter-granting spells and effects through a counter-focused commander. The more varied counters that this deck can provide, the stronger the deck synergizes through its interaction with its general.